as a way to start working with people very early on and start using low doses and working on mitochondrial function, you can see a very significant benefit very quickly. And then it's easier for people in a lot of ways to start doing some of the other things that may be harder to do and that have been more challenging. And then the other thing I know we'll talk about is like the sympathetic versus parasympathetic response and healing. I know you're a big part of this, a big proponent of this as well, but focusing on relaxing the nervous system has been so essential to how, we all have to heal. And that's a big part of things. Of course, if you're so stressed because your mitochondria don't work, you can't just de-stress the system without working on mitochondrial function.
Hey, this is Ari. Welcome to the Energy Blueprint podcast. With me on the podcast for the third time in 7, 8 years, maybe more, is my friend Dr. Scott Sherr, who is a board-certified internal medicine physician, certified to practice health optimization medicine. He's also a specialist in hyperbaric oxygen therapy, and he's the COO of a company called Troscriptions, which we'll talk a bit about in this podcast. His clinical telepractice includes health optimization medicine as its foundation, alongside an integrative approach to hyperbaric oxygen therapy that includes dynamic and cutting-edge hyperbaric protocols, comprehensive testing, targeted supplementation, personal practices, and synergistic technologies, new, ancient, psychedelic, and much more. The first podcast that we did many years ago was all about hyperbaric oxygen therapy. The second one, more recently, maybe a few years ago, was all about methylene blue. And this podcast starts with sort of an update to the methylene blue story and some of the different takes that are out there on methylene blue, because in the span of time from the first podcast to now, it's sort of gone from a fringe thing that very few people knew about to now it's, in a way, it's kind of mainstream. It's gotten a lot of public attention. And then we spend most of the conversation talking about the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic versus parasympathetic, and neurotransmitters, in particular, a neurotransmitter called GABA, and why GABA is so important for most modern humans and why so many of us are GABA deficient. So, with no further ado, enjoy this podcast with Dr. Scott Sherr. Dr. Sherr, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be back with you, Ari. It's been a minute.
It has. I think the last time we saw each other in person, it's got to be 6, 7 years ago at this point.
Oh yeah, long time. We did a podcast for one of your other podcast channels on methylene blue, maybe about 3 or 4 years
Oh,
ago.
that's right.
And
Yeah.
I remember you asking me, Scott, do you think we could do a whole podcast on methylene blue? He's like, that's not going to take very long. I'm like, I promise you, it's going to be fine. And and we and we had a great conversation. I remember
Yes.
too. Yeah.
Yes. And since that time, methylene blue has kind of exploded onto the scene. Actually, before, we planned to talk all about GABA in this one, but it might be worth touching on methylene blue a little bit. Uh,
Sure. Yeah.
since it's become so popular and now somewhat controversial,
Of
it's
course.
gone
Yeah.
from sort of this very fringe thing that very few people knew about to becoming super popular. Now everybody knows about it. Now everybody's running around with blue tongues. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is on airplanes with a blue tongue, and now it's in I don't know, the major newspapers around the world, and
The zeitgeist. Yeah,
yeah,
that's what I like to call
everybody's
it.
talking
Yeah.
about it now,
Yeah.
and also some people are speaking. I don't want to say speaking negatively about it, or are speaking in a way that sort of is doubtful that it has the benefits that are claimed for it. Just curious
Mhm.
what maybe thoughts you want to share on this topic as things have kind of that the whole landscape has shifted in the last few years.
Absolutely. I mean, when we first started the company, the Troscriptions company in 2020, we were the only company and the first to come out with a commercial product that had methylene blue in it. And over the 2020 to 2024, there has been a very obvious and a very significant rise in visibility and very in interest, especially in 2024 there were other people talking about it other than me. In 2023, I was the only person really talking about methylene blue in any kind of context. And 2024, all these other practitioners at all these other conferences I was going to were starting to talk about methylene blue. I'm like, oh, there's something happening here, right? As the old song would say. And then in
I very
2025,
very
yeah,
quickly, I actually want to
yeah,
mention I did a podcast on it back in 2020, um,
did you?
early in on the topic of COVID,
Yeah,
because there was some interesting data coming out that suggested it could be beneficial for that, and it was being used in blood transfusions combined with red light
it
to
was.
basically
Yeah,
create an antiviral effect to sterilize blood. And if you can use methylene blue plus red light in a plastic bag full of blood to kill COVID, there was some interest in that, and I was sort of on to that thread, and I did a podcast with Doctor another Doctor Scott. What was his last name? I'm spacing on his last name, but I did a podcast on that subject.
yeah,
And I know that there were some doctors at that time who were using methylene blue like inhalation. And I will say, I have you beat on exploring methylene blue. I think I was exploring this a long time before you,
sure.
because
Yeah, could
I,
be.
I was doing it as a 10-year-old, playing with methylene blue with this is 31 years ago, with my aquariums, because this is a
Sure,
very
sure.
common
Yeah,
ingredient that is used to treat fish diseases. So
it is. Fungal infections.
I've been
Yeah.
playing with methylene blue for 30 some years.
You're the OG, man, except, so I mean, methylene blue itself, just as a quick primer for those, has been around since the 1870s, actually.
Mhm.
And it was the first drug registered with our nascent FDA in 1897 as a treatment for malaria. And as a profound anti-infective, it got the name of a magic bullet because you could give higher doses, very high doses of methylene blue. You could kill bacteria, fungus, and virus, but you wouldn't harm the host cell, the human cell. And that was kind of why they call it the magic bullet. And so in the beginning of the
Isn't it the
pandemic, there
first pharmaceutical? Doesn't it
it
have
is.
some unique
Yep,
characters? Like it is technically the first
it
synthetic
is.
chemical
Yes.
pharmaceutical ever made.
The first fully synthetic drug made overall is methylene blue. And it was made as a synthetic dye for manufacturing. And then they realized that the class of dyes that it belonged to had antimicrobial properties, the thiazine dye property. And so yes, it does have that, that benefit or whatever it is. That's what it's known
And then it
as
was
the first.
used early on for staining tissues in microscopy, right?
Yeah, so and it still is like in biochemistry class when I was in college, we would use methylene blue as a stain because it actually stains part of your cell called your mitochondria, and it because it actually concentrates in that part of the cell,
Mhm.
and that's where it does all of its redox. It does its energy capacity optimization. It does its detox as well, and so it's on the World Health Organization's list of essential medications still for something called methemoglobinemia, which is when you can't carry oxygen on your red blood cells, typically from a poisoning, from sodium nitrite poisoning. So if huffing glue and huffing paint and things like that, overdoses can actually cause this. So every emergency room in the country, the US at least, carries methylene blue IV in their emergency rooms. And it's also an antidote for cyanide poisoning, which I don't recommend anybody do or get, but cyanide destroys one of the complexes on your mitochondria, complex 4, and prevents it from working. But methylene blue can bypass and compensate for that, allowing you to make some energy, even if you don't have complex 4, which is like your final complex in the electron transport chain that actually allows you to bind oxygen after that and allow electrons to flow. So it's got a very storied history. And during COVID, we couldn't talk about it during COVID, of course, but we had lots of practitioners that were bringing it to people's homes, combining it with near infrared light because there is synergy there. High intensity near infrared light, along with high doses of methylene blue, is anti-infective, and this has been well described in the literature for as an antiviral, as an antifungal, antibacterial. Also being used in cancer this way too. There's been some studies looking at high doses of methylene blue as a photodynamic photosynthesizer for types of chemotherapy and for breast cancer specifically, and for using it in combination with the near infrared light. And so it's got this really interesting history there.
Isn't it
And
red? Small point, but
yeah,
isn't it red rather than near infrared? I thought it was like right around 660. That's the main. Um,
660 to 680. So is that the classification would be red
that's
then?
red rather than near
Okay.
infrared. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Thank you for the clarification. Yeah.
I mean, generally, it's not that meaningful to differentiate the mechanisms, but in this case, it's like the
It is.
absorption of methylene blue is sort of specific, like the peak of the absorption is right in that wavelength range.
Yeah, somewhere between 600 and 680, but
Uh,
definitely between 660 and 680 seems to be the sweet spot overall.
yeah. Yeah, fascinating. And so what do you think of, has there been research that's emerged in recent years that's sort of coincided with the rise in popularity and the trendiness of methylene blue, or is most
No,
of the
actually.
research
Yeah.
still pretty old
Yeah,
and
most of the research has been around for a while, and there's a pretty good, pretty well-respected researcher at the University of Texas, Austin. His name is Francisco Gonzalez Lima,
yeah,
and he's done a number of different studies. He did one on the combination of methylene blue and red light, specifically for a model of Alzheimer's in animals with some significant benefit. And he's done some additional things looking at neurodegenerative disease in general, using methylene blue as the carrier or as the compound really that can really you know, physiologically work on mitochondrial function in a way that can compensate for blockages, for oxidative stress, for, et cetera, and really have a significant benefit. What really changed the whole landscape there was this definitely increase in interest over the last, 5 years. We saw this every year, especially in the practitioner space, was when RFK, as you mentioned earlier, was seen on an airplane using methylene blue in his water.
was
And then
caught with a blue tongue.
yes. And then there was also some additional podcasters with very big platforms that were talking about it and using it. And as a result of that, the sort of the zeitgeist in popular world became gigantic. And that's been great, as you can imagine, in a lot of different ways. But the nuances of how you use it and the dosing is lost on people that don't really understand the science.
Right.
And so the dose response curve thing is probably the most important. So when you have people, the naysayers out there saying that methylene blue is causing a blue brain, for example, or that methylene blue has all these risks for oxidative stress and toxicity and poisoning and things like that, that's all related to a dose response aspect of how methylene blue can be thought of. And because very low doses, 4 milligrams, 8 milligrams, 16, up to even a milligram per kilogram orally are very, very safe and have been shown to be safe for years and years and years. But
They
there
do
are
turn your pee
nuances.
blue.
And yes, even at low doses, they turn your pee blue. So even at 4 milligrams or 8 milligrams, most people will have blue urine. But there are people out there, and these are mostly non-clinicians, honestly, Ari, that are coming out and saying these things about methylene blue that you shouldn't take it for X, Y, and Z, mostly because they're not looking at the dose response aspect of the nuances of dosing and the clinical experience that we've had over the last 5 years is pretty dramatic. I mean, in the beginning, I was even surprised at people coming to me afterwards and saying, I've tried everything, for fill in the blank, my autoimmune condition, my fibromyalgia, my long COVID, although that was a little bit later. And nothing worked except when I started taking a small dose of this and then ramping it up over time. And of course, it's not just about taking one compound. It's about the whole thing. It's just in the sense of what are you doing for your diet, your lifestyle, your stress, and et cetera. But as a way to start working with people very early on and start using low doses and working on mitochondrial function, you can see a very significant benefit very quickly. And then it's easier for people in a lot of ways to start doing some of the other things that may be harder to do and that have been more challenging. And then the other thing I know we'll talk about is like the sympathetic versus parasympathetic response and healing. I know you're a big part of this, a big proponent of this as well, but focusing on relaxing the nervous system has been so essential to how, we all have to heal. And that's a big part of things. Of course, if you're so stressed because your mitochondria don't work, you can't just de-stress the system without working on mitochondrial function too, because that's why that's why somebody's in sympathetic dominance. So bringing in methylene blue has been game changing overall, and it's been a fun ride this year.
I want to circle back to what you just said in a minute, but just to wrap up the methylene blue thing, I think
Yeah, yeah,
part of what's been brought forward by people like Chris Masterjohn
yeah,
I would say him in particular.
yeah. I like
And
Chris. Yeah,
I know you're familiar with his sort of take on this subject because we spoke about it on the phone. And I think some other people have maybe expressed some similar thoughts, probably pulling from Chris. I think Chris is sort of the main one who dug into the research and came to this first sort of I don't know if you that's a mischaracterization, but let's just say he's not very pro methylene blue. Um,
Except if you're on an airplane. He's now agreed that if you fly and you're hypoxic, that methylene blue is something that you could potentially use to help mitigate hypoxic stress. So he's agreed
right.
with that.
So
Yeah.
so
Yep.
that's the distinction that I want to get at is
Yeah.
methylene blue in the context of, let's say, someone who is experiencing some kind of problem, let's say has some deficit of cellular energy production due to being on an airplane or due to a genetic issue or due to poor health, maybe more
Right.
more
You,
broadly chronic
yeah.
fatigue syndrome, let's say
Right.
something like that,
Yeah.
versus someone who is already healthy. And the distinction being maybe methylene blue is genuinely beneficial in the context of a problem state of some kind, but maybe becomes less so or becomes more harmful in the case of somebody who's already well. What do you think of that general distinction?
I think I like Chris Masterjohn's work a lot, and you and I discussed this as you mentioned. He's a fantastic biochemist and really great. He did a great thing maybe about 18 months ago now on the biochemistry of methylene blue and talked about it in detail. And I think the main thing I like to mention here, Ari, is that the statistics are pretty grim. I mean, 94% of US adults have some element of mitochondrial dysfunction. And this is really metabolic dysfunction. What is metabolic dysfunction? Metabolic dysfunction is the inability to make energy effectively. Make energy effectively because you can't do various things, the inputs into the mitochondria itself, or the detoxification pathways that are required to deal with the energy that we make on a regular basis. And so as a result of that, many people, most people have some element of mitochondrial dysfunction already. If you have chronic fatigue syndrome, if you have a chronic complex medical illness, if you have issues with brain fog and fatigue, these are often mitochondrial issues. And so what Chris and what Paul Saladino also both will say is that, well, if you don't have an inherited disorder of mitochondrial function, then you shouldn't take methylene blue. That's kind of ridiculous because so many people have some element of mitochondrial dysfunction already. It may not be a complete blockage of one of the complexes, but they can't make energy from complex one or from complex two very well. And as a result of that, downstream on their electron transport chain, they can't do very little at all to make energy because those first two complexes aren't working very well. You need one and two to be working for three and four to be working most of the time. But with methylene blue, you can bypass some of those dysfunctional complexes, maintain or increase energy production, and actually optimize even complex 4 production itself, the actual complex, while you're doing some of the other work of optimizing your vitamins, minerals, nutrients, et cetera, to work on mitochondrial function. So my first response to that is that it only actually applies to about 6% of US adults overall. Maybe a little bit more than that if you think of all the inputs and outputs that are going inside the mitochondria. When it comes to healthier people that are using methylene blue, in general, it's going to be less often that you would need it because you're already pretty well optimized. But even people that are very well optimized are still under significant stress some of the time. Like on an airplane, for example, is a good example, right? You have hypoxic stress on an airplane. Methylene blue can help compensate for that. It can help with detoxification, so it works like an antioxidant. Can help with it can actually act just like oxygen and be the final electron acceptor in the mitochondria as well. And so that you can continue to maintain energy. So anybody that comes to visit me here in Colorado, they all get methylene blue, hopefully before they even get on the airplane, but definitely when they get off, they get it as well. And I also work with endurance athletes, and this increased aerobic capacity is very compelling, Ari. It's very compelling. And I'm going to be starting to work with a couple of cycling teams to actually show this. But maintaining a heart rate elevation for longer periods of time doing aerobic work is something that could be very, very significant. And that's what we're seeing, at least anecdotally. Now, that being said, if you're well optimized, I don't think you need methylene blue very often, but I think you could use it some of the time, that kind of thing when you're under more stress.
That's interesting that you're exploring the sports performance angle because I was big into methylene blue several years ago, and I remember exploring the research to try to find any studies where they
Yeah.
had tested it, and I found almost nothing.
Yep.
And I was experimenting with it myself to take it, for example, some mornings before I would go surfing or do other forms of exercise, to see if I noticed anything. And I can't say that I ever got a really clear signal,
Mhm.
and I found almost nothing in the research. So it's interesting that you're doing that now, but you're finding improvements in endurance performance.
We are seeing it, but I do want to make this more quantified. And so we are working to get some additional data, hopefully within the next 6 months to a year to be able to show. But it's still the problem with an old medicine is that nobody really cares about it from a research perspective
Or from a financial perspective.
because there's no billion-dollar drug at the end of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Which is the state of affairs for most of lifestyle medicine.
Indeed, indeed, right? So
Yeah.
you have to, it's N of one kinds of things, but now we have more ways of looking at N of one data, which is good. I'm going to be working with a cycling guy up here in has actually he's up in Wyoming, and we're going to be testing him and his athletes and doing some pre-post. So I'm excited for it because I've gotten a lot of reports of positive, especially with hypoxic training associated with methylene blue use.
That's interesting.
Um,
That
yeah,
makes
so
sense in light of the conversation we were just having.
exactly, right? So Brian McKenzie, you probably know, Brian's
Yeah.
a guy that was with Laird Hamilton for many years, XPT. He does a lot of hypoxic training, and he sees points of like 5 to 10 increased VO2 max percentage points by using the combination together,
Is
for short
is
periods.
is that meaning an immediate effect of how they measure it
Yeah,
when you're on methylene blue, or is that over a long period of time that you see greater improvements in VO2 max from?
this is immediate so far. So he'll do hypoxic training, methylene blue on board, do your VO2 max training then, and that's when he sees the increase. But as far as looking at long term, we haven't looked at that yet.
So my only question with that would be, I would wonder if, like taking certain antioxidants blunt
Hmm.
hormetic signal from like exercise, like for
Yeah,
listeners, if I know, Scott, I know you know what I'm talking about, but for listeners, if you take antioxidant supplements in tandem with doing intense exercise, the very short version of this is there's a lot of data that indicates that it actually blunts some of the adaptive stimulus, the hormetic stimulus from exercise, and actually, to some degree, suppresses or inhibits the adaptations that your body makes to exercise. I would wonder if methylene, I know that antioxidant function is kind of complex and it can
yeah.
potentially even act as a pro-oxidant, but I would wonder if it might get in the way of the adaptations to hypoxia.
It's a good question. I think the jury is still out, but my sense of it is that it depends on the type of training that you're doing. If you're doing more anaerobic work, then I do think that I have a question as to whether methylene blue is a good idea or not.
Mhm.
But from an aerobic capacity perspective, I have a sense that it is potentially more beneficial, but we still have to figure this out overall.
Yeah.
But it's a really good question. All right.
Very, very interesting stuff. So thank you for indulging me into the
Of
methylene
course.
blue discussion.
Good
Let's
stuff.
let's dive into the nervous system and neurotransmitters. And I want to come back to something you said a few minutes ago that was very
Yeah.
intriguing to me. Um, you said something to the effect of linking mitochondria to being in a sympathetic to a parasympathetic state. It's rare that I hear someone directly link the mitochondria to the autonomic nervous system. I have kind of my own model for discussing that, but I'm curious
Hmm.
what you've come up with or how you've put the pieces together on in terms of that link.
Well, it's such multifaceted in a way to describe it, and there's so many different angles in. I think maybe the best angle in is, I've been a clinician for a while now. I think I started seeing patients 20 years this year, which is crazy. And that was my second year, my third year of medical school. And so, um, as a clinician, what I've figured out over the years is that within about 30 seconds to 2 minutes, I know if I can help somebody or not from a physical perspective. I work in hyperbaric medicine. I work in something called health optimization medicine, which is a foundational approach to health, and it's a nonprofit. And you've interviewed Dr. Ted and me, I think, on this topic in the past as well, many moons ago. And so Dr. Ted's the founder. And what I realized very quickly is that there's a certain, significant subset of people that have such sympathetic dominance. Their fight or flight system is so high that no matter what you do from a diet, from a supplementation perspective, lifestyle, if, of course, lifestyle kind of corresponds to what I'm about to say and the other things too, but if you don't focus on that sympathetic dominance, nothing else is going to work. And that could be something as easy as just doing some breath work and learning how to meditate, or it could be as hard as dealing with, childhood trauma and sexual abuse and things like that that might be just their nervous system is just so elevated. And this is because, one of the hormones that gets elevated all the time when we're always stressed is a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol is our stress hormone. We need cortisol. That's what gets us, that's what gets us going and running from something that's trying to chase us and eat us, back in Paleolithic times. It doesn't happen much anymore, maybe an ostrich or something, but they're probably just trying to scare you away. But in general, cortisol is fantastic, but if it's elevated for long periods of time, it starts to deteriorate your whole nervous system, your mitochondria get super, super inflamed and stressed as a result of it. And you also deplete a very important neurotransmitter called gamma aminobutyric acid, or GABA for short. And GABA is our primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in our brain. So it calms things down, as opposed to our excitatory neurotransmitters, one called glutamate, which is our primary excitatory neurotransmitter that nobody knows about. But glutamate is between glutamate and GABA, that's 80% of your brain's neurotransmission, actually, altogether. And you have your superstar neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, your dopamine, serotonin that everybody knows about. And your norepinephrine, of course, is the one that's also involved in fight or flight. And so if your norepinephrine is elevated, your cortisol is elevated. If your cortisol is elevated, your norepinephrine is elevated too. So the key that I found over the years is to really focus on that parasympathetic activation, that especially that GABAergic neurotransmitter system, because so many people out there don't realize, and clinicians, even myself and others, before I really learned about this, people are walking around are GABA deficient and they don't know it. And they'll go to their doctor complaining of anxiety, complaining of insomnia, complaining of depression. But really what they're not serotonin deficient. Like, they are GABA deficient, actually, instead.
It's an interesting way of describing it. Um, so basically, this chronic sympathetic dominance
Yep,
leads to a GABA deficient state.
it can. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It,
And
it
because,
you
yeah,
you said, sorry, go
go
ahead.
ahead. I was just going to just mention, yes. And so because your GABA is trying to relax the nervous system, but you're not able to make enough to support your system if you're always in sympathetic overdrive. And
Mhm.
so GABA gets depleted very quickly, and it's always in balance with this other neurotransmitter, glutamate. So glutamate is our primary excitatory neurotransmitter. GABA is our primary inhibitory. Glutamate is converted into GABA in the brain. And you need the cofactors vitamin B6 and magnesium to do that.
Okay, this is kind of a very biochemistry centric view of this. Can
Of
we,
course.
so
Yeah.
let's, and you've done this to some extent already, but can we like expand this out to how a person lives, how a person behaves? As an example, in
Of course.
the slides that you shared with me on GABA from your presentation, so that I could prep for this interview. One of the interesting studies that you cited was on yoga, how yoga influences the amount of GABA that's in the brain. So this links up with how we behave, sort of in
Mhm.
both directions, presumably. Like, if we are
Absolutely.
behaving at the macro level, like, instead of looking at it in terms of receptors and neurotransmitters and this mechanism and this nutrient is a precursor for that chemical and we have a tendency towards biological or biochemical reductionism, where
Sure.
we in our sort of current zeitgeist of way of conceptualizing things, most people are running around thinking that chemicals in their brain control them, and there's sort of a lack of integration with the fact that also one's behaviors influence those chemicals. And it's like, oh, the chemicals are controlling me, so I need to take other
Mm.
chemicals to
Yeah, well
control
said.
those chemicals so that, and of course, the most famous version of this sort of
Yes.
oversimplified biological reductionism is the SSRI serotonin deficiency, model of depression. And that interest that whole story is, I think, even just worth exploring here because we had essentially, I don't know, was it 30 years or maybe more than 30 years of generations of hundreds of millions or billions of people being indoctrinated into this idea that basically depression is a neurochemical imbalance in the brain. That's the cause, quote unquote, of depression. It's essentially like a serotonin deficiency. What it boils down to is that's really what they were saying. It's you have too little serotonin, therefore you need to take these drugs that increase the amount of serotonin in your brain, these specific serotonin inhibitors, and decades of this idea, you know, being the public being indoctrinated with this idea. God knows how many billions of dollars in sales of these serotonin related antidepressants. And then just recently, I think it was 2 years ago, a year ago,
Yep.
something like that,
Hmm.
there was a big review paper that basically came out and said there really isn't any evidence to support the serotonin model of depression, the serotonin deficiency model of depression. And like, which is itself, I mean, I almost want to do 5 hours of discussion just on that phenomenon alone.
It's amazing that can happen. Yeah.
The
Yeah.
fact that what we
Yeah.
think of as quote unquote evidence-based medicine, and we build this whole mountain of knowledge and claims and drugs and this whole industry around this claim, and then decades later, yeah, it turns out there wasn't really any evidence to support that. Um, and not to mention the fact that even if serotonin were mechanistically related to depression, it would still be wrong to claim that the cause of depression is this deficiency of serotonin and that the way to correct it is with a drug that increases serotonin in the brain. That would still be a horrifically reductionistic and oversimplistic way of conceptualizing this problem, which again, just and I could go all day on this subject, so I won't. But I just want to link this back to the fact that most people really are stuck in this idea that chemicals in their brain are controlling them and have really I would say, a deficiency in understanding of how their actions and their behaviors are influencing those chemicals.
It's well said. All right. Overall, I mean, the review paper that came out a couple years ago was a bombshell overall, where, as you mentioned, billions of people getting treated with serotonergic drugs with a lack of serotonin deficiency. Serotonin deficiency is not what causes depression. And that whole hypothesis has been debunked, and many other things like that have been debunked over the years too, after
Yeah, the
years and years.
Alzheimer's amyloid
Yep,
plaques thing too.
exactly. That's what I was thinking. And I love the perspective you take here because I think it's super important. In fact, I was talking to a patient of mine yesterday who loves to look at all of his lab work and then throw it into ChatGPT for all the things that he needs to do to
Uh-huh.
fix it, right?
Yeah.
But what I've been having him do over the last couple of weeks and months and longer is slowly like, well, what if you didn't take any supplements? Would it be okay? You know, what if you didn't actually change your diet and just ate what you felt intuitively to do? Would you be okay? And this is where you're going, is that the things that we're doing from a lifestyle perspective, the things that we do every day, we don't realize what we're doing oftentimes. And he doesn't realize it. He doesn't. And until I tell him, like, well, let's talk about this for a minute. Do we really need to look at every single marker today? Is this going to change anything? And the answer I keep telling him, and this is something that's very common, is like, we need to focus on the basics. You are always stressed. You have this stress level that's up here all the time. Your capacity is significantly diminished to be able to understand that's where you are, because that's where you always are. But things like yoga, for example, like you mentioned, things like breath work, where relaxing breath work, increasing your exhales, even exercise to some degree can help reset your nervous system in a way to help you down regulate that nervous system, down regulate that sympathetic overdrive. And the consequence of that sympathetic overdrive is really what I was describing biochemically. But from a lifestyle perspective, the hustle culture, the never sleep culture, the sleep until we're dead thing, the sleep is for quitters, which is the shirt that I used to wear in medical school when I was there with my friends. And like that kind of culture is what's really depleting us. And that one of the neurotransmitters that really becomes an issue is this GABA neurotransmitter system that as a result of the stress and the lifestyle and the diet and the things that we're following gets significantly impacted overall. And then we're stuck in this sympathetic dominant state, these states of one of them often the one I like to kind of think about for people that's very common, used to be more common when we were younger, is MSG syndrome,
Hmm.
which is you go to a Chinese restaurant and you have sweetened food with monosodium glutamate. Glutamate, again, is a excitatory neurotransmitter. So you go home, you're irritable, you have headaches, you can't sleep. This is sort of an acute glutamate, toxicity in quotes. But this is how people feel all the time, right? And that's what they're feeling is that this is the neurotransmitter imbalance that they have because of the lifestyle, and because of the relationships and everything else that's going on. There are simple things that we can do to really start modulating this in a more optimal way.
Hmm. What do you think are some of the key nutritional aspects of this story? Do
Yeah,
you think GABA deficiency ties into how people are eating as well?
absolutely. Yeah, because so our small intestine specifically, the primary fuel of our small intestine is an amino acid called glutamine. And glutamine is also the precursor to this other amino acid called glutamate that I was mentioning earlier. And then glutamate gets converted into GABA. The issue is that so many of us are walking around with a gut that's leaky. It doesn't have the capacity to keep things in it and allows things into the body, as you well know, that can be inflammatory, work with, that can be a detriment to our immune system, cause inflammation. And then also when our gut is leaky, our brain also, the blood-brain barrier also becomes leaky as well. And so what I find is that if you have a leaky gut and a leaky brain, which often happens in correspondence with each other, you are not going to feel very good. And you need more glutamine, for example, to try to heal your gut. And not enough is going to get to your brain to actually get converted over to GABA as well. So that's a very common one that I see. And what often people will do here is, and this is kind of diagnostic, interestingly enough, from a clinical perspective, is if you take GABA supplements. If like, oh, I need to relax, I'm going to take GABA. GABA is too big of a molecule to get across into the blood-brain barrier through the brain typically. But if you take GABA and you feel more relaxed, it's almost diagnostic that that barrier is not doing what it's supposed to do. And that correlates, of course, to having a leaky gut as well. And so
So, meaning you're saying that GABA can reach the brain
it
directly,
should
but
not. No,
in the context of gut permeability?
yes, exactly. So if there's gut permeability, there's often blood-brain barrier permeability.
Uh-huh.
And then that permeability is going to allow GABA, which is too big of a molecule typically, to get into the blood and get into the brain to get across. And so I've talked to clinicians for years about this as a diagnostic signal that the brain barrier is not doing what it's supposed to do, that it's leaking. And then that the gut is leaky as well. So it's just another diagnostic way of understanding that somebody typically has a leaky gut. And so that's where you need to address. You need to address the leaky gut and the gut inflammation. Even inflammation in general, Ari, is also going to be an issue because inflammation also has an effect on the enzyme that converts that glutamate to GABA in the brain. And so, vitamin mineral deficiencies, magnesium and B6 and things like that, as I mentioned, but inflammation is also going to do it in general as well. So it's that conversion that's really important and that balance between that glutamate and the GABA. And so nutritionally, where I'm usually going here is actually looking at data if I can, or symptomatically, if somebody's coming in with GI related symptoms, that's where you approach first before going, the neurotransmitter route oftentimes. Like focus on the gut is it's a common way to do things in clinical practice, as you know. So
Are there any other nutritional factors that come to mind here?
the main ones I think I've described here, but when it comes down to sympathetic activation, this is going to deplete lots of different things over time because if you're sympathetically overactive, you're going to deplete your B vitamins, your antioxidants, your minerals. And so it's very easy for me, like looking at a panel, for example, to know when somebody's sympathetically on overdrive. With clinical information too. And so when I talk about GABA deficiency with patients, it's a clinical diagnosis for the most part. I mean, you can look at data, it can help correspond to what's going on. But if they're anxious all the time, if they're depressed oftentimes, if they can't sleep, this is often correlated to GABA deficiency, because we know that one of the main roles of GABA itself is to be like a waylay station. It's a gate. It's called the sensory gate, where it prevents us from getting overwhelmed by thoughts and information. And if you don't have enough GABA around, we get overwhelmed by thoughts and information. And like on average, do you know how many thoughts we have on average per day, Ari, as a guess?
Me or the typical person?
Typical person, average human, typical thoughts per day.
Might be a difference. Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
um, let's
Doesn't have to be,
say
it's not
let's
unique
say
thoughts.
300,000.
So that's quite an estimate. So on average, the average human has about 70,000 thoughts per day. And
Okay,
that's
so
not unique.
300,000 for me.
That's a lot for you. Yeah, that's a lot. If you're anxious, if you're stressed or you're depressed, you can get up to
Under book deadlines, too much work to do,
yep,
lots
yeah,
to think about.
exactly. Yeah. And then if you're one of those
That's why
people that,
my when I'm sitting at the dinner table and my wife's like, "Hey, where are you? Snap out of it. You're zoning off. You're in your own little mental world." I'm like, "I got stuff to think about. Just relax."
that's hysterical. But what GABA does is help calm down the firing of the thought generator. Don't believe everything you think, everybody. If you're thinking 120,000 different thoughts, or it doesn't have to be different thoughts, but 120,000 thoughts a day. So GABA helps calm all that down. So if you're one of those people, as am I, sometimes just like you, like your mind just keeps going and going and going. You're trying to go to bed, but your mind just won't shut off. Like it's the GABA system that's typically involved in that. So supporting it with the vitamins, minerals, and nutrients that it needs can be very, very helpful in this case with the dietary factors, with the lifestyle factors, of course, that are thrown on there. And then, sometimes supplementation as well, that's going to modulate the GABA system in comprehensive ways that affects it, so that you can get an immediate effect while you're doing some of the harder work of changing your diet and changing your lifestyle, working on your stress and your breath work and going to a yoga class or whatever it might be,
Mhm.
and getting your gut all healed up, which can take time.
Okay, I want to touch on two things that you mentioned here. One is GABA absorption into the brain.
Mhm.
It's been probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 years since I last looked into that research, but what I recall, maybe this has changed since I looked into this, but what I recall is that there was some controversy around whether GABA can be absorbed directly into the brain or not, and that there was speculation on another potential mechanism, which was absorption via the vagus nerve,
Right.
like
Right.
uptake from the vagus nerve in the gut, and that the GABA is actually traveling up the vagus nerve into the brain. Has there been any further research in this, and any more knowledge sort of that's updating what the consensus view is?
Mhm. So right now, what we think is that GABA doesn't travel on the vagus nerve, but what can happen is in the gut, you have certain bacteria like lactobacillus and bifidobacterium specifically that make GABA in the gut. And that causes vagal signaling, via acetylcholine, via the neurotransmitter itself that the vagus nerve runs on, which is acetylcholine, that causes signaling cascades in the brain that help potentially with the conversion of more glutamate to GABA and
Mhm.
increase GABA signaling. But it's not a direct pathway that way. And
Okay.
then as far as whether GABA can get into the brain or not, there's still very little evidence that GABA itself as a molecule can get across into the brain. So there's the signaling from the gut for sure, but that's the main additional pathway other than GABA being converted from glutamate in the brain itself.
Does it need to get into the brain itself if it can essentially act on the brain via the gut, via the vagus nerve?
So the answer is yes, because it does need additional signaling in the brain. The gut is not going to take all of it's not going to be enough for just signaling in the gut via the vagus nerve to enhance the GABA system as much as it needs to be overall modulated. But it definitely helps a lot. And so that, having a good and optimized, GI system can be very, very helpful here. There are some formulations that may get into the gut. So if it's a nano, like liposomal, so extremely small fat globule that can potentially get across. There's also the potential you can actually make it with a vitamin B6 attached. So it's called nicotinyl GABA, sorry, vitamin B3. So nicotinyl GABA, vitamin B3 attached to a GABA molecule, and that can get across the blood-brain barrier. And so you can use vitamin B3 because the B3 has a transporter. It gets across, and then it hydrolyzes the B3 and GABA. And so you have increases in vitamin B3, increasing GABA in the brain as well. So that's another way to get GABA in there. Or you can use things that are called GABA mimetics or mimetics, things that work on the GABA receptor where GABA would bind. And that the one that we use is something called agarine, which is from a psychedelic mushroom called the Amanita muscaria mushroom. It's the Santa Claus mushroom. Yeah.
Yeah, this was interesting. Um, Actually, but before we dig into that, I want to come back to one other question
Yeah. Yeah.
on something you said earlier. Let me remind myself what it was. Glutamate. So glutamine is the precursor for both glutamate and GABA.
It goes in that cycle. So it starts with glutamine, and then it gets converted into glutamate, and then from glutamate it gets converted into GABA. Yes.
So what what would make sense to me, given that they both share this precursor molecule of glutamine,
Hmm.
and you talked about sort of the gut barrier integrity element of this, but what also would logically, I would think, would influence this is a person's behaviors and whether they are sort of, let's say, already in more of a sympathetic state versus a parasympathetic state, whether they are spending their day like really working hard in a very stimulated state, being super active, using their
Hmm.
mind without a lot of rest, versus if they live a more leisurely lifestyle, does more of that precursor glutamine essentially get directed towards glutamate because that's what's needed, and maybe there's less left over of GABA, essentially as the body's way of basically just facilitating the way that a person lives. That's
Right.
what's needed in that person. So it would make sense to take more of the glutamine, make it into glutamate rather than GABA.
Yeah, I mean, I think the feedback loops are interesting, right? In the sense of it depends. The body's very good, the brain's very good at shunting to where it needs to go.
Hmm.
And so if you need more glutamate because that's what you're doing, you're going to also have less GABA available as a result. And then you'll feel like you're still wound up and can't relax because of that feedback loop as well. That's been modulated in the way that you've done your lifestyle in a way that's allowing it to happen that way, right? And so most of us are, especially a type A kind of person, are going to be more glutamate dominant than GABA dominant. It's very uncommon to be GABA dominant. Um, GABA deficiency actually is something that runs in families. If you have alcoholics in your family, alcohol binds to the GABA receptor, and it's going to increase the amount of GABA that binds to the receptor, increase the affinity. So alcoholic families tend to have people that have either issues with their enzymes and conversion, but they tend to be more GABA deficient. And when they take alcohol, they feel normal, right? And this is when they're actually balancing that ratio more between their glutamate and GABA. So, I mean, we know alcohol is not good for us for a lot of different reasons. It binds very tightly to the GABA receptor. It increases the amount of GABA that to bind, and then as a result of that, it makes the GABA receptor do various things to try to compensate, leading to things like withdrawal, potentially if you stop it too quickly, to tolerance and dependence. Um, but in some people, they only feel normal when they drink alcohol or they work on the GABA side of things because they're GABA deficient all the time and they're anxious all the time and they're overstressed all the time. And this is something that they've probably learned behavior over time in some people too, but there's also familial there's also something that can be inherited in this side as well, interestingly enough.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the Santa Claus mushroom now,
Yeah.
Anita
Yeah.
muscaria. Um,
Yes.
your company is the first I've heard of anybody using any kind of extract from that mushroom. Uh,
Hmm.
you said it was called agarin, and agarin works as a GABA agonist. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it binds exactly where GABA would bind on the receptor of
Hmm.
the GABA receptor. So GABA has, it's called a pentameric structure. It's not a big deal, but it just has all these different sites on it where things can bind. And either it can bind where GABA would bind, or it can bind to these other sites. If it binds to these other sites, it can either increase the affinity for GABA to bind, or it can decrease the affinity, but more likely it's going to increase. And so things like alcohol and benzodiazepines, kava, CBD, CBG, these are all binding to these what are called allosteric or separate sites and increasing binding affinity for GABA to bind. The problem with things like benzos and alcohol, barbiturates, sleep medications like Ambien, Lunesta, and other things, they bind so tightly to the GABA receptor that they deplete GABA very quickly, and they make the GABA system remodel itself in a way that makes it over the long term, as mentioned, with alcohol, tolerance, dependence, and withdrawal, right? So your plants, things like kava, your cannabinoids that are non-psychoactive like CBD, CBG, CBN. By the way, THC is the opposite. THC binds and decreases the affinity for GABA to bind. And that's why people that take THC often will get anxious, actually, because it's more of that glutamate overload compared to the GABA that can't bind. And so Agarin is directly binding to where GABA would bind. And so what we do at our company at Troscriptions is we combine something that binds to where GABA would bind, and then we have an allosteric or a separate thing that binds on another side of the GABA receptor together. And that combination is allowing more GABA affinity without causing GABA deficiency because it has a GABA mimetic, something that works just like GABA as well. So less of a risk of having things like tolerance and issues over time taking it. Because even kava over time can cause this with people. Like they can get, people can get addicted or tolerance to kava as well, for example.
Mm, interesting. Okay, so what else is in the supplement that you sell? It's agarin and
So we have two that are based on the GABAergic neurotransmitter system. We have one that's called Trocom, and this is for anxiousness, for stress, for tension. I find it's really great in a pinch. Like if I'm after a day like today where I've been on calls all day, like taking a little bit of that just
I'm stressing you
decreases.
out. Is that what you're trying to say?
No, no, this has been great, man. Like, but it's been a long day of calls, and this is my least stressful call all day, actually. I enjoy this
Good.
podcast, and you're great as well, Ari, at always keeping people comfortable, and your questions are awesome always. What it does, it just down regulates your nervous system just a little bit to take the edge off,
Mhm.
and then you can take a bigger dose of it if you want to even take the edge off even more, if you like more significant anxiousness. But it has it has vitamin B3 attached to GABA, that nicotinol GABA, kava, CBD, and CBG. And it's been like in a troche form, which is a buccal or dissolvable lozenge in the mouth. And you can take a quarter of it, a half, a full, depending on what you need. And that really does have a fantastic way of just taking the edge off, quieting down your mind, and just making you feel like you're more in your body, right? And that's a big thing. Like being back in your body after being like so mentally driven for so many of us is like it's just so much more relaxing, And so and that's what it's great for. And then we have something called Troz, which has the agarin in there, along with something called hanokiol or hanakiol, which is from magnolia bark, and that is also working on the GABA system. And combined together, really great for sleep. Also have a little bit of 5-HTP, a little bit of melatonin, not much. CBD and CBN, both working on the endocannabinoid system, but also the GABA system too, along with something called cordycepin from the another great mushroom called the cordyceps mushroom, the zombie mushroom, the one that takes over insects and famous for The Last of Us show on HBO right now. But low doses of cordycepin, the active ingredient, actually increase deep sleep and work just like a neurotransmitter called adenosine.
That's
Adenosine,
interesting that you would put cordycepin into a sleep supplement because normally that would be more in
yeah,
energy formulas or adaptogen.
cordyceps. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cordyceps, the mushroom, is more of an adaptogen used in the mornings, but cordycepin, this active ingredient, only about 0.03% of the mushroom, so a very small amount, is an adenosine agonist that increases deep sleep. You can modulate in other ways and block adenosine in the brain and use it with caffeine, for example, to get fancy and use it for exercise. But it's a fantastic deep sleep inducer because adenosine is a neurotransmitter that builds up in our body as the day goes on, as we make more energy as a byproduct of energy metabolism of ATP, as you know, Ari, and then it makes us feel sleepy at night.
So the extract you're using is a pure cordycepin. as opposed
Yes,
to like a
pure cordyceps.
cordyceps sinensis with like a higher concentration of
Correct.
cordycepin.
Correct.
It's
Yeah,
pure
it's
cordycepin. Wow, that's interesting.
pure. And then we actually have another product called Tromune, which is pure cordycepin at higher strength, because cordycepin as a single ingredient is also a fantastic anti-inflammatory. It works on multiple inflammatory pathways, and it's also an immune system modulator. It's an antiviral. It's even being studied as an anti-cancer because one of our base pairs in our DNA is called adenine, and adenosine is its precursor, and then it can get inside fast replicating RNA and stop replication. So it's great for viral infections and maybe even cancer too. It's being studied there. So we use it as a standalone formula. It's one that I use on a regular basis, especially when I travel overall, because I find it to be really a great way to not get sick going to conferences all the time. So
Hmm. Good stuff. Dr. Sherr, I guess two last things to wrap up, because I know we only have a couple minutes here.
yeah,
One is let people know where they can follow you, where they can learn more or buy those supplements that you just spoke about, the
Mhm.
Troscriptions, and the other thing is leave people with maybe like two or three key takeaways of how they can start to take action to get control of their autonomic nervous system if they are in that chronically stressed, chronically sympathetic overdrive sort of state.
For sure. So the company is called Troscriptions, and you can find us at troscriptions.com on the web, on Instagram. I also have my own personal Instagram at Dr. Scott Sherr. So you can check out Trocom, Troz, so for anxiety relief, for sleep, and Tromune if you're interested in immune system optimization. Many of us are. And then also, of course, our methylene blue containing products, Just Blue and Blue Canatine. So you can check those out. I do a lot of education on all these topics, and I've talked to Ari a couple times about some, and so you can check out more information. Our blog has tons of information as well on all of these topics. I write or I edit every single blog that goes out. Um, this hits home to me, Ari, as far as trying to really work on sympathetic overdrive. And if you have tons of companies, you have tons of kids, and I have both. And I mentioned it earlier, but find ways to get back into your body or get out of your head, right? Whatever really is that is good for you. Sometimes that's like rolling on the floor with a puppy, right? That's a great one. Or rolling on the floor with your kids, or going outside and walking in nature, or just learning that you can just modulate your breath in a very easy way just to increase your exhales to start feeling like your nervous system comes down, right? You don't have to measure everything. You don't have to take every supplement in the world, even our stuff. Like there's lots of great ways to learn how to downregulate your nervous system. When you do that, you will start healing. You will heal better. You will recover better. You will build more muscles. Like if you want to be huge, like Ari, not me, but like Ari, like you need to have a sympathetic nervous system that comes offline so that you can build protein, you can build muscle and protein synthesis. Like it's really important. So find ways, everybody's going to be different, but get off your screens typically. Find a way to, take away from, take away from the sort of hustle bustle and find ways that really, serve you to relax. And, for me, that's playing with my kids. That's going in my infrared sauna, which I love. That's meditation. That's breath work. And that's just going outside for like 2 minutes between calls and taking off my shirt and just getting some sun. Like that'll do it sometimes. And sometimes that's all the time that we have. So
Does the hospital allow you to do that? If your
I do it all.
patients
I mean,
walk by and see you outside the hospital with your shirt off, does anybody get weirded out?
I probably would have gotten fired for it at some point, but thankfully that's behind me. So now I just go
Doc-
back in my backyard and I'm good. So
Dr. Sherr, it's always a pleasure chatting with you. It was great to catch up with you, and I look forward to the next conversation.
thank you, Ari. I really appreciate your time. It's been fun.